May 1945. Germany is collapsing beneath the blows of Allied armies. Cities smolder, rail lines lie twisted like broken strings, and what was once a functioning state recoils into chaos. In the middle of that disintegrating world, a single man vanishes into the fog. A bureaucrat by trade, an engineer by training, and an architect of some of the Reich's darkest projects. His name was Hans Kammler. Kammler's life does not read like the biography of a household name Nazi. He is not a Himmler or a Speer. He did not make speeches that echoed on radio waves. Instead, he was the kind of technical operator that totalitarian systems prize. Quiet, capable, and terrifyingly efficient. He turned blueprints into factories, camps into logistical systems, and ultimately rockets and secret weapons into reality. For those who knew what he had built, his disappearance at the end of the war is not merely a footnote. It is one of the 20th century's enduring mysteries. Hans Friedrich Karl Franz Kammler was born on August 26, 1901 in Stettin, a port city then in the German Empire. He came from the sort of Prussian household where order and duty were cultivated as virtues. His father was a civil servant. His upbringing emphasized discipline, study, and respect for hierarchical authority. Kammler's early life was not marked by political drama. It was marked by mathematics and material science. In the chaotic aftermath of the First World War, with Weimar Germany staggering under political and economic upheaval, Kammler chose the path of the technocrat. He studied civil engineering in Danzig and later in Munich, showing early talent for structural problems. By 1929, he had completed a doctorate in civil engineering. A practical man, schooled to solve problems by calculation and design rather than by rhetoric. When the political ground shifted under Germany in the early 1930s, Kammler was one of many professionals who saw opportunity in the rising movement that promised order and renewal. In 1931, he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party and, soon after, the SS. For a man of technical skill and ambition, the new order offered access to projects and resources that a struggling republic could not. His decision appears pragmatic rather than prophetic, a calculated alignment of career and the new centers of power. His ascent was steady and unspectacular at first. By the mid-1930s, he was employed in the Reich Ministry of Aviation and other government construction offices, working on infrastructure projects for the Luftwaffe and the expanding war economy. What set Kammler apart was not ideology alone, but an administrative aptitude. He could marshal materials, coordinate contractors, and produce results on a scale few could match. That competence brought him to the notice of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who prized managerial minds as much as ideological zeal. Himmler valued fixers, people who turned abstract plans into functioning systems. Kammler was such a man. In the late 1930s, he moved into the SS construction apparatus, and his responsibilities quickly broadened from hangars and barracks to industrial complexes and, ultimately, to the infrastructure that made mass murder efficient. It is vital to understand what that role entailed. Kammler was not a frontline executioner. He did not pull triggers. He was the engineer who optimized the machinery of death. His office signed off on expansion plans for camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek, specifying railway access, barracks capacity, crematoria throughput, and the logistics of forced labor. To him, these were problems of flow and capacity, measurable, solvable, and within the realm of technical mastery. To millions of victims, they were instruments of annihilation. Witnesses later described Kammler as a man of cool, almost bureaucratic composure. In meetings, he spoke quietly and precisely. He was not given to grandstanding or theatrical cruelty. That composed demeanor made him more dangerous in some ways. Where fanatics rallied crowds, Kammler made systems run. The outbreak of full-scale war only increased his importance. As the Reich's military fortunes diverged and Allied bombing threatened Germany's industrial base, Kammler became central to an increasingly desperate project, moving essential production underground. Allied air power had rendered many surface factories and facilities vulnerable. The answer, from the Nazi perspective, was to bury production in tunnels and mountain caverns beyond the reach of bombs. That task required not only ingenuity but authority, and Kammler soon had both. By 1943, his scope had expanded dramatically. Elevated to the SS rank of Brigade Führer, a position equivalent to a major general, he controlled vast resources and a brutal labor pool. Under his direction, prisoners from concentration camps were used as forced labor for construction projects that would shelter rockets, aircraft, and other high-priority military hardware. His name becomes linked with Mittelwerk, the subterranean assembly complex near Nordhausen where V-2 rockets were built, a place where technological ambition and human suffering met in brutal proximity. The Mittelwerk project is a crucial pivot in Kammler's career. Following the Allied bombing of Peenemünde in August 1943, German leadership decided to relocate the V-2 rocket production underground. Kammler orchestrated the repurposing of old mine workings near the Mittelgebirge, converting them into a vast subterranean manufacturing labyrinth. Tunnels were widened, lines of assembly installed, ventilation systems built, all using the coerced labor of prisoners drawn from nearby camps, including Buchenwald and Dora Mittelbau. This was not peripheral work. Kammler coordinated logistics, material allocations, and construction priorities. He negotiated with armaments ministries, with firms such as Heinkel and other contractors, and with SS economic offices that supplied labor. The result was a nightmarish industrial complex where technological sophistication rode alongside grotesque human cost. Rockets rolled out of those tunnels with simple, tragic regularity, a marriage of engineering where precision met brutality. In late 1944 and early 1945, Kammler's remit widened still further. With the formation of special task forces like the Jägerstab, a high-level body created to protect and accelerate aircraft production, Kammler's expertise was brought to bear on nearly every major effort to salvage the Reich's aerial capabilities. He supervised the dispersal and hardening, front production for aircraft and missiles, planned underground sites for the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, and oversaw efforts to keep key personnel and technologies out of enemy hands as Allied forces closed in from west and east. His elevation to this role made Kammler a man with extraordinary power inside a collapsing regime. Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, would later describe the era as one of frantic improvisation. Kammler was one of the men called upon to make improvisation work. He had access to scientists, to forced labor, to material priorities, and, some wartime accounts suggest, his own unofficial latitude to get things done. And yet, for all his managerial reach, Kammler remained a figure of contrast, a technically minded operator who seemed to care more for timetables than for ideology's rhetoric, a man who could command resources and get factories buried in the earth, yet leave few traceable emotional traces in the written record. By April 1945, as Soviet and Allied forces closed on German territory, the structures he had built were crumbling. Records were lost, subordinates fled, and the labyrinthine infrastructure that had sustained so much of the Nazi war effort began to fragment. It was in that disintegration that Kammler's story takes its most enigmatic turn. Rather than become a well-documented captive or a publicly tried official, Hans Kammler vanished. Reports, rumors, and fragmentary telegrams suggest he issued orders in early May. Instructions to destroy records, to evacuate key personnel and material. Then, abruptly, he disappears from the normal channels of history. No confirmed witness placed his body. No reliable custody records show him in Allied hands. For a man who had engineered the hidden infrastructure of a murderous regime, his removal from the historical ledger would be both perplexing and ripe for speculation. In the coming blocks, we will follow that disappearance into the tangle of wartime chaos, allegation, and post-war intrigue. Through allegations of suicide, claims of capture by Allied intelligence, and the slow, stubborn research of historians who, decades later, still argue over where Hans Kammler went and with that he might have known. By late 1943, Allied bombers ruled the skies over Germany. The industrial heart of the Reich, its factories, refineries, and supply lines, was being torn apart night after night. Hitler demanded an answer, and for the men of the armaments ministry, that answer was speed, secrecy, and survival underground. No one embodied that command more completely than Hans Kammler. After the bombing of Peenemünde, the coastal research center where Wernher von Braun and his team had designed the V-2 rocket, Kammler was assigned a monumental task: rebuild the entire rocket production program beneath the Earth's surface. It was a logistical nightmare on a scale few could comprehend. The underground site would have to house assembly lines, power systems, storage depots, and launch preparation areas, all in tunnels hewn out of solid rock. Kammler's solution was as brutal as it was effective. He seized control of an abandoned gypsum mine near the Harz Mountains in central Germany and transformed it into a subterranean factory complex known as Mittelwerk, or Central Works. Over the next months, tens of thousands of forced laborers, many transferred from the Buchenwald concentration camp, were marched into the mountain. Their task? To carve out and build the facility that would produce Hitler's so-called miracle weapons. For the prisoners, it was hell on earth. The tunnels were damp, airless, and filled with dust. They worked 12-hour shifts with minimal food, constant beatings, and no medical care. Thousands died each month from exhaustion, starvation, and execution. Their bodies were dragged to nearby pits or burned in the open air. The Mittelbau-Dora camp, built specifically to supply labor for the factory, became one of the deadliest in the entire camp system. Kammler visited often. Survivors later recalled his clean uniform, his cold eyes, and the precise questions he asked about output and efficiency. He wanted numbers: units completed, parts assembled, failure rates. To him, the prisoners were not people, but resources, variables in a production equation. His reports to Himmler and to Albert Speer read like technical documents: tonnage of concrete poured, kilometers of tunnels. Completed, rocket components delivered. Nowhere in them was there any mention of the dead. Under Kammler's direction, Mittelwerk grew into one of the most secret industrial complexes in Europe. 2 main tunnels stretched more than a mile into the Kohnstein mountain, linked by a maze of side galleries. Inside, German engineers assembled the V-2 rocket, the first long-range guided ballistic missile in history. It was a weapon designed to strike cities hundreds of miles away at supersonic speed, a technological leap that would lay the foundation for the Cold War's missile age. Each rocket was nearly 14 meters tall, carrying a 1-ton warhead. When launched, it rose silently into the sky and fell on its target faster than sound. London, Antwerp, and Liège were among the cities hit. Civilians never heard it coming. Between September 1944 and March 1945, more than 3,000 V-2s were launched, killing around 9,000 people. Yet the program consumed far more lives than it took. Over 20,000 prisoners died building it in the tunnels of Mittelwerk. Kammler, however, was promoted again. Himmler called him the miracle man of production. Albert Speer, though increasingly wary of Kammler's growing autonomy, admitted that no one else could have delivered results under such catastrophic conditions. By early 1945, Kammler controlled not only the V2 program, but a wide array of underground sites producing aircraft, jet engines, and new weapon systems. His influence extended across the collapsing Reich. He coordinated with Messerschmitt engineers on the Me-262 jet, with Junkers on bomber prototypes, and with SS economists on relocating entire production lines below ground. He ordered tunnels dug beneath mountains, quarries, and mines, and in many cases he personally selected sites from aerial photographs and geological maps. Entire villages were cleared so that his teams could carve secret caverns beneath them. To many in the Nazi hierarchy, Kammler seemed untouchable. His loyalty to Himmler and his reputation for delivering results made him a rare figure, a technocrat with near-total autonomy in an empire of chaos. Yet those same qualities made others fear him. As the war turned decisively against Germany, power shifted rapidly between competing factions. Himmler's SS, Speer's ministry, Göring's Luftwaffe, and Kammler moved among them all, leveraging his control of technology and infrastructure. In January 1945, as the Eastern Front collapsed and Soviet troops swept into Poland, Kammler's portfolio expanded again. Hitler appointed him plenipotentiary for jet aircraft, granting him direct control over all advanced aviation programs in Germany. It was a staggering level of trust in the final months of the regime. In effect, Kammler now commanded the Reich's most secret technologies: the V-weapons, the jet fighters, and the scientists who built them. He was also responsible for keeping those technologies out of enemy hands. As Allied forces advanced from both directions, Kammler ordered the evacuation of key personnel and documents from central Germany to Bavaria and Austria. Special convoys carried scientists like Wernher von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and other rocket specialists southward, men whose knowledge would soon become prizes in the post-war scramble for German expertise. Kammler's staff destroyed sensitive blueprints, dismantled equipment, and buried or blew up evidence of the underground complexes. But amid this organized chaos, another side of Kammler emerged: the survivor. Multiple witnesses later testified that by April 1945, Kammler was no longer acting as a loyal servant of the Reich, but as a man preparing for the next chapter, whatever that might be. He arranged secret meetings with rocket engineers, hinting that they should seek capture by American rather than Soviet forces. He reportedly told one subordinate that the war is lost, but our knowledge is our passport. His statements suggested a clear awareness that the value of technology might outweigh guilt in the eyes of the victors. On April 19, 1945, he met with von Braun and his team in Oberammergau, a quiet Bavarian town near the Alps. According to post-war accounts, the meeting focused on how to ensure the scientists' safety and how to avoid falling into Soviet hands. Some accounts describe Kammler as calm and deliberate, others as nervous and withdrawn. Either way, he appeared to understand that Germany's defeat was only days away, and that he held secrets worth trading for survival. After that, the trail begins to fade. In late April, Kammler reportedly ordered his staff to move remaining V2 documentation and personnel toward the mountains near Salzburg and Linz. He issued telegrams instructing SS officers to destroy records in Mittelwerk and other facilities, signing off with his characteristic precision. Then, communication ceased. By May 7, a final message bearing his name was received, ordering the destruction of files and the evacuation of sites. 2 days later, Germany officially surrendered. What happened next remains one of World War II's most persistent enigmas. Some reports claim that Kammler shot himself near Prague on May 9, telling his driver to leave him alone before pulling the trigger. Others suggest he was killed by his own men, or that he slipped into Allied custody under a new identity. The lack of physical evidence, the absence of a body, an autopsy, or reliable witnesses has allowed speculation to flourish for decades. To the Allies, the disappearance was convenient. Declaring Kammler dead simplified the paperwork and avoided awkward questions about who might have gained from his knowledge. For post-war Germany, it offered closure, a bureaucratic solution to a moral problem. But for historians, the silence around Kammler became fertile ground for rumor. Was he truly dead? Or had he, like so many of the Reich's scientists and engineers, simply changed sides? As the war gave way to occupation and the Cold War began to form, the story of Hans Kammler became a ghost story of modern history, a tale of technology, secrecy, and vanishing men. What is certain is that the systems he helped build, the rockets, the underground complexes, the forced labor networks, would cast a shadow far beyond 1945. In the next block, we'll follow that shadow into the post-war years, how the Allies searched for Kammler, how his name surfaced in intelligence reports, and how the myth of his survival became tangled with Operation Paperclip and the birth of the space age. May 1945. Germany was collapsing into ruin. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Across the smoking remains of the Reich, chaos reigned. Millions of soldiers were surrendering. Prisoners were wandering the roads, and entire towns were abandoned. Amid that collapse, one man simply vanished. SS General Hans Kammler, the engineer who had overseen the most secret weapons projects of Nazi Germany. When the dust settled, Allied intelligence realized something chilling. Kammler wasn't just another bureaucrat. He was the man who knew everything about Germany's advanced weapons programs. The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the underground complexes, and the scientists who built them. If he was alive, he was a prize beyond measure. If he was dead, his knowledge had died with him. The hunt begins. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, Allied field units and intelligence officers scoured the occupied zones, searching for surviving Nazi officials. But Kammler was a ghost. His name appeared in a dozen different reports, each contradicting the other. One document claimed he had shot himself near Prague on May 9. Another said he had been captured by American troops in Austria. A third suggested Soviet forces had taken him east. None of them provided proof. The Americans were particularly interested. Within the U.S. Army's new intelligence branch, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, rumors circulated that Kammler might still be alive and in hiding. Agents knew that he had controlled the transfer of the rocket scientists who later surrendered to the Americans in the Alps. The very men behind Operation Paperclip, the secret U.S. program to bring Nazi scientists to America. Wernher von Braun and his team had already begun their journey westward, surrendering to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Kammler, it seemed, had helped arrange that exodus. It was hard to believe that he hadn't planned the same escape for himself. Paperclip's shadow. Operation Paperclip was born out of both fear and ambition. The Allies, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, were now locked in a silent race for German technology. The V-2 rocket was not just a weapon. It was the foundation for the next era of warfare. Whoever controlled the engineers who built it would control the future of flight, missiles, and even space. Von Braun, Dornberger, and more than 100 scientists were quietly transported to the United States under new identities. They were housed at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where they continued their rocket research for the U.S. Army. Their knowledge was invaluable, but their pasts were inconvenient. Many had worked directly under Kammler, overseeing slave labor in the tunnels of Mittelwerk. For the American government, it was easier if Kammler had simply disappeared. By late 1945, OSS officers were circulating classified memos referring to a high-ranking SS general with technical knowledge of rocket production, possibly under U.S. custody. The name was never printed, only initials, HK. British intelligence picked up similar whispers. Reports from their own teams in occupied Germany mentioned Dr. Hans Kammler, SS general, presumed to possess extensive details of V-2 production in the Harz region. But again, no capture was ever recorded, no interrogation files ever surfaced. It was as if the man who had built an empire of tunnels had simply stepped into one and sealed it behind him. Competing theories. Over the decades that followed, historians and intelligence veterans would argue endlessly about Kammler's fate. The simplest theory, and the one accepted officially in post-war Germany, was that Kammler had taken his own life near Prague on May 9, 1945. His driver, Kurt Pruk, and another SS officer, Heinz Zeuner, later testified that Kammler had ordered them to leave him alone, then shot himself with his pistol. They claimed to have buried him near a small forest clearing. No body was ever found. To the courts of West Germany, that was enough. In 1948, a Berlin court declared Kammler legally dead as of May 9, 1945. The case was closed. But to many, the story didn't add up. The testimonies were contradictory. The alleged burial site was never verified. And Kammler's telegram, sent 2 days before Germany's surrender, proved he was still issuing orders at the time. Could a man that methodical, that calculating, really have ended it all in a ditch? A second theory suggested he had been captured, or even protected, by the Americans. The logic was chilling but plausible. Kammler possessed priceless knowledge, the locations of underground factories, the structure of SS research divisions, and, perhaps most importantly, the detailed documentation of V2 engineering. To the Americans, his survival might have been a strategic asset, not a liability. In the early years of the Cold War, dozens of former Nazis were quietly absorbed into Western intelligence networks, their records erased in exchange for cooperation against the Soviets. Could Kammler have been one of them? In the 1990s, fragments of declassified documents hinted at something more. A report by the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps mentioned a German SS officer of general rank providing technical consultations in southern Germany, September 1945. No name was attached. Another memo, written by Brigadier General George MacDonald in November 1945, requested a renewed search for Kammler, Hans, SS general, possibly in U.S. custody. Again, no follow-up. The ghost in the archives. By the 2000s, Kammler had become more myth than man. He appeared in conspiracy books, documentaries, and Cold War thrillers, the archetype of the vanished Nazi scientist. Some claimed he had been flown to the United States under a false identity and lived quietly under government protection. Others insisted he had been interrogated, then quietly executed. A few, diving deep into fringe history, tied him to the so-called Nazi UFO myths. Absurd, but a testament to how far the story had drifted from verifiable truth. Then, in 2019, new evidence surfaced that reignited the debate. German researchers Rainer Karlsch and Frank Dobert, working with the Wilson Center, published documents suggesting that Kammler may indeed have been captured by U.S. forces near Prague in May 1945 and secretly transferred to Bavaria for questioning. Their findings cited references in both American and German archives to a senior SS officer with unique technical knowledge held for debriefing at U.S. facilities. According to their theory, Kammler's supposed death near Prague was a fabrication, a convenient cover story to hide his cooperation with the Americans. Skeptics pointed out that even these new records were circumstantial. No fingerprints, no photographs, no signed confession, nothing that could turn speculation into fact. But the absence of proof only deepened the mystery. Because if Kammler had lived, he would have been one of the most valuable and dangerous men in post-war Europe. A man who knew the entire architecture of Hitler's secret weapons and the atrocities that built them. A man too guilty to stand trial and too useful to discard. The technocrat's legacy. In a way, Kammler's greatest invention was not the rocket or the underground factory. It was the ability to disappear behind them. His bureaucratic mind had built not just tunnels and machines, but systems, hierarchies, paper trails, command chains. Those systems designed to make murder efficient now hid their creator from history itself. When historians sift through the ruins of the Third Reich, Kammler's name appears again and again in blueprints, memos, and signatures, but never in person. His handwriting fades after May 1945. His files end mid-sentence. Even his family, left behind in Berlin, received no body, no grave, no closure. Just a verdict: declared dead. And yet, the legend endures. To this day, the fate of Hans Kammler remains one of the Second World War's last unresolved enigmas, a story that blurs the line between history and conspiracy, guilt and survival, technology and terror. In our final block, we'll explore that legacy, how Kammler's disappearance shaped post-war myth, how his ghost lingers in the archives of both East and West, and what his story tells us about the dangerous marriage of ideology and technology. Hans Kammler's name faded from official records after 1945, but it never faded from history. Like a shadow cast across the ruins of the Third Reich, his story refused to die. Every decade since the war has uncovered a new layer of his mystery, a whisper, a file, a theory that reawakens the question: what really happened to the man who built Hitler's most secret weapons? The birth of a legend. In the early years after the war, as Europe rebuilt, people wanted closure. There were trials, Nuremberg, Dachau, Hamburg, where SS officers faced justice. But Kammler was absent from all of them. His name was barely mentioned. Even though his signature appeared on documents authorizing underground camps, forced labor projects, and V2 production, the man himself was already a ghost. To many, that silence was unbearable. By the 1950s, as Cold War tensions deepened, conspiracy theories began to grow around him. Writers and journalists speculated that Kammler had not died in a forest near Prague, but had escaped, maybe to South America, like other high-ranking Nazis who slipped away through the so-called rat lines. Argentina, Chile, even Antarctica. His name appeared in the same lists as Mengele and Bormann. Yet, unlike them, no witness ever came forward. No photograph ever surfaced. He had simply vanished. Cold War shadows. The mystery of Kammler's disappearance took on new meaning during the Cold War. By the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a battle not only for global power, but for control of the narrative of World War II. Both sides had absorbed Nazi scientists into their programs, men who once worked for Kammler's SS research network. In America, Wernher von Braun was now a celebrity. His rockets launched NASA Saturn V and took humans to the moon. In the Soviet Union, captured V2 engineers had laid the foundation for the R-7 and the early space race. The technology that had once rained destruction on London now carried astronauts into orbit. And yet, behind it all, lingered the invisible hand of Kammler, the administrator who had organized the system that made it all possible. Some historians began to ask uncomfortable questions. How much? What of that technological progress was built on human suffering? And did the US and Soviet governments bury the truth about Kammler to protect their new scientific assets? Declassified CIA documents from the 1980s suggest that Allied investigators were still searching for him decades later. A memo labeled Top Secret, Eyes Only mentioned continuing reports of an SS General HK, presumed dead, possibly residing under assumed identity in US sector. Another British file, now public, noted Kammler's knowledge of underground facilities may have been utilized post-1945 under American supervision. Neither document confirmed anything, but both hinted at something deeply unsettling: the Nazi bell and the fringe frontier. By the 1990s, Kammler had crossed from history into legend. Authors began linking him to one of the strangest stories of the Third Reich, Die Glocke, The Bell. According to these fringe accounts, the Bell was an experimental Nazi device supposedly built under Kammler's supervision in a secret facility near the Czech border. Descriptions varied. Some said it was a kind of advanced anti-gravity engine. Others claimed it was an attempt to harness zero-point energy or time travel. None of these claims had physical evidence, but they had one thing that made them irresistible: the name Kammler. He had become the perfect ghost, secretive, brilliant, morally corrupt, and missing. Whenever history offered a mystery, a hidden bunker, an unmarked airfield, an unidentified photo of SS officers, Kammler's name was invoked like a spell. He had transformed from a real man into a symbol of everything terrifying about Nazi science: genius without conscience. Even credible researchers struggled with the fog of myth. In archives across Europe, Kammler's paper trail still ends abruptly in May 1945. But the sudden silence itself seems suspicious. Too clean, too convenient. The man who built the Reich's largest underground empire didn't just vanish. Someone helped him disappear, or helped erase him. The ethics of oblivion. Kammler's story forces us to confront a haunting moral dilemma that still echoes today. What happens when a man's crimes are unforgivable? Inseparable from his knowledge, can a civilization built on technology afford to erase its darkest engineers? The Americans faced that question in 1945. To win the Cold War, they needed minds like von Braun's. They needed the V2 secrets, the data from high-altitude tests, the blueprints for underground construction. But to get them, they had to ignore where those discoveries came from slave laborers who died by the tens of thousands in Kammler's tunnels. The Mittelbau-Dora camp, where prisoners were worked to death building rockets, was Kammler's creation as much as the rockets themselves. In a grim irony, the modern age of space exploration began on the graves of those workers. Kammler's bureaucratic genius, his ability to make horror efficient, became part of the machinery of progress. And when that history became inconvenient, it was simply filed away. That's why the mystery of his disappearance still matters, because the question of what happened to Kammler is really a question of what happened to accountability. Did he die in a forest, or did he live long enough to see his legacy reborn in the laboratories of a new world power? Did the victors bury him because they needed his knowledge, or because they shared his guilt? Echoes in the present. Today, nearly 80 years after the war, Kammler's name occasionally resurfaces when new archives open or when forgotten photos are digitized. In 2019, the German Federal Archives released a batch of declassified files from the Allied Control Council, and among them were several references to Kammler's post-war movements. They were vague, incomplete, but enough to spark new debates. Was he interrogated in Bavaria? Did he cooperate? Or was he quietly executed? Modern historians like Rainer Karlsch argue that Kammler's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was policy. By declaring him dead, both Germany and the United States avoided the embarrassment of explaining his fate. Kammler's story was simply too explosive. He was too guilty to pardon, too valuable to expose. Others believe he really did end his life, that the cold technocrat, faced with the collapse of his empire, finally saw the abyss he had built and stepped into it. If that's true, then his suicide wasn't an act of redemption. It was just another calculation, one final decision to erase himself rather than face judgment. The man who built the abyss. In the end, Hans Kammler represents the ultimate paradox of modern warfare, the engineer who turned science into horror. He never fired a gun in battle. He never led troops into combat. And yet, his signature condemned thousands to death and shaped the weapons that defined the future. He built the machinery of destruction, and then, like his creations, vanished in a cloud of smoke. When we study his story today, it's not just about one man. It's about the danger of intelligence without empathy, of progress without morality, Kammler wasn't a monster in the cinematic sense. He was something far more terrifying. Ordinary. A man who saw genocide as logistics and innovation as a means to power. That's why his disappearance continues to haunt historians. Because perhaps, in the end, Kammler didn't vanish at all. Perhaps he simply became part of us, of the systems we inherited, the technologies we celebrate, and the cold efficiency that defines the modern age. The tunnels he built may be silent now. The rockets he engineered may have taken humanity to the stars. But the question remains, can progress built on atrocity ever truly escape its shadow?